Welcome to Meet, Act, and Part, a Masonic podcast hosted by Midnight Freemasons, Greg Knott, Darren Larners, Todd Vriesen, and Bill Hostler.
All right, everybody. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Meet, Act, and Part. And welcome to episode 44. So we've got a special guest tonight, but as we always do, let us introduce ourselves first. I am one of your co-hosts, Greg Knott.
And I'm Bill Hostler.
And I'm Darren Laners.
So we're with a very special guest tonight, across the ocean from us, and Brother Chris Earnshaw, who is joining us. And we're just probably going to be on all kinds of topics tonight. I didn't know Chris until recently via email. He reached out to us, and I was glad that he did. And just all kinds of interesting things we can talk about. But Brother Chris, you're in Japan, and whereas it's our evening here in the Midwest, it's about late morning in Japan, as we record this anyway. And so What I'd ask you to do is just, if you don't mind, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your Freemasonry. And then, of course, we'll dig real deep into it as we go through.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. So I've been a Mason now for 35 or 36 years. In Japan, we have a single Grand Lodge, but we have lodges from other constitutions here. And I'm a member of an English, Japanese, Scottish and Massachusetts lodge in Japan. So I'm quite active. I'm also in the Scottish Rite and York Rite. That's about it, Masonically. Yeah.
So did you grow up in Japan? How did you end up in Japan to begin with? We'll talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So as you can tell from my accent, I'm British. I left England when I was 20 to come to Japan. The reason being was when I was 20, that was in the mid-70s, 1970s, and there was a lot of unrest in England concerning the economy, Thatcherism and nationalization of industries and things like this. And one of the issues was whether Japan was dumping cars in England. And at the time, I was studying economics at high school, and I thought that people didn't really understand the situation correctly. I didn't think Japan was dumping cars in so much as they were able to make cars much cheaper and more efficiently than British industries could, and therefore they could sell them cheaper overseas. And it got me interested in understanding Japan and the Japanese. And so I decided to come to Japan to study Japanese. And for 1 year, in England, we have something called a gap year, which is after high school, universities, once you've been accepted, offer you 1 year off to kind of get high school out of your system, go on a holiday, go hitchhiking something, or do some volunteering somewhere, and then start university. So for my gap year, I decided to come to Japan, study the language, get to know the culture, and then when I went back to England, I would do Japanese and economics. But what actually happened is I just got so enamored with the country. I stayed here, and I've now been here more than something like 45 years.
That's interesting. You know, I think it's that gap year. I think I might have had more than one of them. I don't know about the rest of you, but if not, I certainly would have benefited after high school. You know, it's of course in the States there's the pressure to go right to college, and
yes,
not so much do that. And it's funny, I think so many kids would benefit by getting it out of their system, so to speak, and have that year of exploratory to figure out what you want to do. And it sounds, obviously that's led to your path, really straight door to us tonight, as you've,
yes,
explained. So, we'll get into Freemasonry, but I certainly remember in the 70s growing up, and I'm sure Bill and Darren too, about the automobiles, and, of course, General Motors and Ford and Chrysler are big three here in the U.S. And then I remember my parents talking about, at least the perceived threat of not only Japanese imports, but from other places as well, coming to the States and affecting us. And so it's just so interesting how something like that and, 50 years ago, really shaped your decisions to, not only go study about it, but to, as you said, become enamored with the Japanese culture and stay and really live there and learn so much more. I guess my first question, then we rotate our questions, of course, as we go here. Freemasonry. How did it catch your attention? You said 35 years. What got you interested in becoming a member?
Yes, basically my family, all Masons on both sides of my family. And I think though they didn't really talk about it at home, and even if they did, I wouldn't have understood it, but it had quite an impact on our family. I think there was one incident when I was must have been about 17 or 18. My grandfather, who was obviously a master mason, he was ill at home, and the Speaker of the House of Commons came to our house. Well, Speaker, House of Commons, the equivalent, I'm not quite sure, maybe Nancy Pelosi or someone like that, suddenly appears on your doorstep, asking inquiring about my grandfather's health. And I was so surprised. And that image remained with me for a long time, that, somebody of his standing would come to see my grandfather. I didn't know the person's name, but I'd seen him on television, so I knew that much. And then, I really realized that, looking after each other is a central tenet of Masonry, and that really inspired me.
Let me pass to Darren. Just so many things, Chris, we could go down tonight and down those various tracks. Let me let Darren pick one of those avenues and we'll start exploring.
Brother Chris, it's my understanding that your specialty or your current research is regarding Chinese Taoism and then how it potentially is an origin for modern speculative Freemasonry. So we're just going to dive right into the deep stuff right now. Why don't you just kind of let rip with what kind of led you to this path of research and what you've discovered, and we'll go from there.
Fine. So when I was made a master, I think I have to backtrack slightly, because in England, we used to have something called a classical education, which is where students would have to study either Latin or Greek at school. And at my school, we all studied Latin. And so I was fairly familiar with a lot of the mythology and the stories, Roman stories and Greek stories, because that's part of the education. Unfortunately, modern students in England don't have this opportunity to study the classics. So when I became a Master Mason, one of the first things that came out to me was in the third degree, where it says that our ancient brother Pythagoras called out Eureka on discovering something. And I know it isn't Pythagoras that's called out Eureka, it's Archimedes. And I wondered why in the 1700s, people who all had classical educations would leave something in the ritual that was so wrong. And I wondered, it really intrigued me. Was it wrong for a reason? Was it like a hint or something? Or was there some sort of code or hidden teaching about this? Because it's Archimedes discovered the displacement of water and how to measure irregular objects. And that's why he exclaimed Eureka. So I started looking into this, and other things started popping up. For example, the phrase we say Freemasonry is a peculiar system of morality. What's peculiar about it? Well, peculiar has two meanings. One is unique and another one means eccentric or strange. So in the unique sense of peculiar, Freemasonry's morality teachings are not unique at all. They're exactly the same as Christianity. So that's not true. And then what about eccentric? Well, there's nothing eccentric about Masonic's moral teaching. So what is it actually saying? Is it really a peculiar system of morality? And the second point was that early Masons tended to be slightly elite. They were looking to bring in members of the aristocracy and gentry into Freemasonry. And at the time, there was a kind of prejudice against the Scots and Irish in London particularly, but also throughout England, because of the law that was introduced in the late 1680s, but also because they were Catholics. And England was a Protestant country, and this was an extremely important point that people tend to forget. So therefore, the Scots and Irish set up their own Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, and they became kind of competitive with the Grand Lodge of the Moderns, who were the speculative Masons, who later became the Grand Lodge of England. And so the Moderns tended to attract the aristocracy. Well, are you going to teach the aristocracy a system of morality? I think the aristocracy would be affronted by the idea that they needed teachings in morality. You know, these are people fairly high position. They've had good educations, all had private educations. And now you want to teach me about morality? No, I think there's something else to that phrase, a peculiar system of morality. So anyway, to put that aside. So when I came to Japan, I was 20. I got a job and I decided to study university as an external student. So in those days, we didn't have the internet. We sent correspondence, letters to and from university with our homework and all the other things that we had to do. And this for me worked very well because I was able to pay the work and pay the university fees. So I had no debt at all. And in fact, it was extremely cheap to be an external student. And I studied Japanese and Chinese at university. And one of my specialties, you had I think 5 specialties that you had to take. And one was the economic system of the Tokugawa era. I remember that very well. Another one in Chinese philosophy was the study of Mencius, the Chinese philosopher. And I was very attracted to Mencius's thinking. Of course, Mencius, he died somewhere in about 300 BC. So we're talking about a very old teaching of philosophy. But even though his book is extremely old, the teachings to me seem to be very modern and very, very interesting. So even after leaving university, I kept on reading Mencius. My book has fallen apart. I've had to buy a new one. And so about 4 years ago, I was invited to Taiwan to attend a kind of conference on Mencius and Chinese philosophy, which included Taoism. And the conference was at a Taoist temple. And I was offered the opportunity to be initiated in Taoism. Taoism is very different from what we think of as religion because it's syncretic. So they don't mind Buddhists joining Taoists or Christians being Taoists. You can be both at the same time, which is rather unusual by Western thinking. And they also don't see themselves as a religion, but more as a way of life, a way of how to act in life and how to treat each other. Anyway, so I went through the initiation, and what I immediately recognized was it's the same as the first degree initiation in Freemasonry. And I was completely bowled over. I was kind of gobsmacked. Just my jaw was open. Just every element seemed to be the same. For example, they have 3 candles on their altar. They bring the light from the east to the candidate. They have 3 senior officers, and the most senior officer is known as the light transmitting officer. And there's so many other things. This really, really surprised me. And so coming back to Tokyo, I had to look into this. I just did Freemasonry get its ideas from Taoism, or is it the other way around? Did the Taoists learn from the Freemasons? Well, it didn't take very long to find out that Taoism has a history of over 2,000 years, probably nearly 2,400 years. And so it wasn't the Taoists learning from Freemasons, that's for sure. But then how did the Freemasons learn from the Taoists is the question. And that's what I spent 3-4 years studying. And I culminated by writing a set of 4 books called Spiritual Freemasonry, which explains each degree and its position in teaching Taoism to the British Masons.
Brother Chris, do you think that maybe I'm just going to put on my my thinking cap here? Is it possible that like these ideas are so ancient and so old that they come from potentially, one of the older mysterious religions, the Egyptians, and as the Egyptians traveled, maybe they spread some of these ideas to the East, or do you think maybe it's the other way around, as some of the Eastern philosophies were spread by travelers from the East to the West? These ideas were adopted.
Yes, so that's the first thing I started thinking about, was how these ideas could have come to England. So what I found was, starting in the 1660s, there was a lot of interest in China in England at the time. There were missionaries from Catholic missionaries from France, the Netherlands, and Spain going to to China, and they translated Chinese books into Latin and then brought them back to Europe. And so the Royal Society that was established in 1660 started looking at Chinese language to see if it was a universal language, a single language that existed before the Bible, that everybody spoke. And so it was just a lingua franca, as you would say. Another area was that from the 1660s, tea became very popular in England. Before that, they had chocolate and coffee, and now tea was starting to be imported by the importers. Yes. And besides tea, we got silk for the first time, became very popular and affordable as well. And furniture was coming over. And with tea, but previous to that, we used to drink mainly beer in England. People drink beer all day long, even for breakfast. And they used to thin it down for children. It was called small beer, where they water it down and reduce the alcohol content. So they were drinking out of earthenware mugs. And the tea, to drink the tea, they also imported Chinese tea, Chinaware. Teacups and things like teapots. And the aristocracy started collecting these, and it became a real fad, particularly because Queen Anne was a very dedicated collector of Chinaware. And when the king and queen does something, then the aristocracy copy. And when the aristocracy does something, then everybody else kind of tries to copy. It's just like modern days when you have influencers or celebrities doing something, then everybody else copies. And it's the same in the 1700s. Following this, what we saw was a move in architecture in England. So many of the aristocracy started introducing Chinese decorations into their houses. Some of them had Chinese gardens built. Other people had tea houses, or some of the rooms in the houses had Chinese wallpaper. Then in London, in the Royal Gardens at Kew, we built the Queen ordered that a pagoda be built, and it's still there. 300 years later, this wooden pagoda is still standing there. At the time, we're talking about now the late 1760s, the Prince Regent, Prince of Wales, he was son of King George III. King George III had a serious neurological disease, and later in his reign, he started to lose his mind. There have been films made about this. And so later, the son took position as Prince Regent, the Regent meaning he was standing in for the king. And then when the king died, Prince Regent became George IV in 1820. But until then, the Prince Regent was just a playboy. And he spent a lot of money building his royal residence in London, which is Carlton Palace, and he had that decorated in Chinese style. And then in the south of England at Brighton, he had the Royal Pavilion built. Royal Pavilion is a really beautiful building, very strange in an English countryside. It's built in a kind of Gothic Indian style on the outside with these onion domes and lattice work and things. But inside is mainly Chinese. So what was happening was that so many things were being imported from China. It became not just in England, it became a European-wide phenomenon. And one of the things is that furniture designs were also changed to incorporate Chinese motifs, and this is called chinoiserie. Chinoiserie was very popular, particularly in France, but all over Europe. Rich people were building Chinese-style houses, even in Germany and France, they still exist. In Russia, they built Tsarina, I forget her name, Catherine first? Yes, Tsarina. She built a whole town on a Chinese style with Chinese roofs and a copy of the Chinese pagoda. So Chinese things were very, very popular at this time. A second thing was that I mentioned earlier, the bifurcation of modern speculative masons and the Grand Lodge of the Ancients. Well, the Grand Lodge of the Ancients were copying the first three degrees, but they introduced a fourth degree, the Royal Arch. And this was kind of their selling point, because the speculative masons only had 3 degrees and the ancients were teaching a 4th degree. They started teaching this. It's hard to pinpoint it exactly, but it would have to be about 1740, something like 15 years after the 3rd degree was introduced in England. So from here, the Scots wanted their own, and the Irish wanted their own degrees. So the Royal Arch was seen as being a kind of Irish degree, and the Scots had their Mark Master degree, and they really wanted to incorporate this into the into the Lodge of the Ancients. So then they introduced the Mark Master degree, and then the Irish introduced an Irish Master degree, and all these degrees started proliferating. And this is actually the start of Scottish Rite, because these degrees then went to France. They were taken there either by Jacobites or Irish armies that were placed in France to help with the wars that were happening in Europe at the time. And being Catholic, then they went to help the Catholic King Louis XIV. So when they went, they took with them their rituals and ideas, and also some of the senior members of the Royal Arch of the Lodge of the Ancients. They also went to France to open lodges, and so they were hoping to set up their system of Freemasonry in France. It's a very complicated situation because the French also had their own system of lodges. But anyway, I'm going a little bit too far. So what happened then was that King George, when he became king, he sent a delegation to China. That was rebutted because for diplomatic reasons. And then the Opium Wars started, something like 1830. And the Opium Wars were started because England was growing opium in India and selling it to the Chinese in exchange for silver, and also tea and Chinaware, which they brought back to England. They reinvested in England. They put more money into growing opium. So it's a triangular trade between England, India, and China. And the emperor did not appreciate the British, doping down his population. There was a lot of issues with people not being able to work because they were stoned all day long in China. And so also the money was leaving China, which was also not appreciated by the emperor. And then the Opium Wars started, trade with China stopped. And then what happened was, just at the same time, Champollion translated the Rosetta Stone that had been found during the Napoleonic campaigns in Egypt. Suddenly, trade with China stopped, and then there was interest in Egypt, and what we call Egyptomania started. And with Egyptomania starting, Freemasons in the 1820s and 1840s were looking back 100 years and thinking, did Freemasonry start in Egypt? And therefore, this idea of an Egyptian and also a gypsy origin for Freemasonry started. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
So, going back to our American grade school days, and I think Bill and I certainly were about the same age, probably had these same lessons. It seemed to be all about the tea here also. I mean, again, now the States.
Yes. The Boston Tea Party.
In many ways, you were describing all that. I'm thinking, in present day, it's like not much has changed in some ways. You talked about the social media influencers, and back, 400 years ago plus, it was those influencers that were people trying to emulate or, moving housing styles back to Europe and this, that, and the other. It's so many ways. It's like we don't change as humans. And, as you were constructing that path back from, the Far East to Europe, you see that direct line. And so I guess my question, and I'd like Bill to maybe weigh in on this also, we have the lore of, we don't know where the Freemasonry rituals come from. At least that's as you come through the Grand Lodge of England and all those in the States, because we say they're ancient and we don't know where, if they came out of the stonecutters guilds and those kind of things. And from your timeline, it really is more recent than it was talking about some of those ancient, stonecutters from, 1200, 1300s or whatever that evolved into the speculative craft that we know today. Have you looked at any of that? And
Yes.
I'll have Bill can ask some follow-up questions on it, but I was wondering, where does that timeline start to intersect?
Yes. So to do with stone cutters, I believe what happened was that the first three Grand Masters, who were Anthony Sayre, George Payne, and John de Sagulier, they decided to use the operative Freemasons structure to incorporate some Taoist teachings. The reason being is because they wanted to attract the aristocracy into their new organization. The operative Freemasons, I believe, are based on stonemasons guilds. And the stonemason guild probably started about the 1200s, 1300s, basically to protect people's jobs and also to enforce standards in the industry so that prices were set. And most of the guilds, for example, people who were working with leather, there were saddle makers, there were arrow makers, there were even fletchers, people who put the feathers on arrows. You'd have thought that was a single job, but actually it was two people, two different guilds, and people working with gold. And there were probably over 100, 150 of these guilds. And they had to get a warrant from the local authorities to work, and they decided the prices, and this was set by the local community. One thing is that we didn't have inflation in those days, so for 200 years, prices would never have changed, and people's lives, they knew what to expect in their life. If you had this job, you would earn this money, and then you'd be able to afford something. There was no worries about prices going up and loss of work. So one of the things that's unique about the guild system is that they have patron saints. And of course, in those days, England was a Catholic country. It didn't become Protestant until 1534 with King Henry VIII. So before that, we were a Catholic country. We had patron saints, and the guilds every year would have put on a holiday, a feast for the patron saint. It would incorporate sometimes a play, some sort of education or teaching about morals or biblical studies, and later sometimes the saints' lives and things like this. And it ended up becoming quite an extravaganza. Originally, they would do it in a church. It would be just an afternoon's event, and then people would go and get drunk. But later, it got larger so that they had these touring companies from certain, like the Corpus Christi from, I think it was York. And they would tour the country. They go for like 2 weeks, holding these plays on public land, the green, as we call it, the commons. And they would then be so large that various guilds would all get incorporated. It wouldn't be one guild. It'd be several or 10 guilds. There may be up to 400 people. They all had to learn their lines. So it was quite a complicated system. But one of the things is that the stonemasons were not a guild. They were a fraternity. And the reason they were a fraternity is because they had to travel. So guilds had a certain jurisdiction where they could sell their wares, like like say a leather saddle. If you wanted a leather saddle, you'd have to go to Norwich or someplace like that to get it. But the Masons would go overseas. They go to Scotland, all around the place, building castles, abbeys, cathedrals, rich people's houses and things, all made of stone. And so they were called fraternities. So come the late 1600s, these fraternities were falling apart. They had initiation ceremonies, of course, and passwords and things, but people couldn't remember it. They weren't doing it properly. They kind of shortcut that you could bribe somebody to get into the fraternity. So the situation was not good. And then the three Grand Masters, including de Sagulier, there was this Chinese boom going on. Everybody was interested in Chinese. They had books about Chinese philosophy, including Taoism, the I Ching and the Tao Te Ching coming into the country. There was also, and this, I think this is key for me in my theory, in 1687, a Chinese Mandarin from Nanjing, the capital of southern China, came to England. Now, a Mandarin is a senior government official, and we know his rank by the clothes he's wearing. Includes the hat, the type of materials were used, the decorations on his clothes. This was all prescribed by law in China. You just couldn't wear anything. And so by looking at his clothes, we know his rank was quite high. His name was Shen Fuzhong. And so this Mandarin Shen came to England. He was introduced to Thomas Hyde, who was the senior librarian at the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford. Oxford had collected many Chinese documents and books over time, but they couldn't read them. They didn't know whether to read from left to right or bottom to, just didn't know how to read the characters. So Shen translated many of these documents for Thomas Hyde. Not only that, he taught him about Taoism, the I Ching, and many other things. We know this because of letters between the two that still exist and are at the British Museum. And so Thomas Hyde was then taught about Taoist things, and I think he was taught about this Taoist initiation. Therefore, then from Thomas Hyde, he was friends with Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton. Both these people were alchemists, and alchemy was also very popular at the time in Oxford. So these alchemists, Isaac Newton, he worked with both George Payne and John de Sagulier. So Isaac Newton may be the link between Thomas Hyde and the first three Grand Masters. John de Sagulier was the Isaac Newton's secretary at the Royal Society, and Isaac Newton was also a director of the Mint, the Exchequer, which is U.S. in America, the U.S. Treasury. He was a senior director there, and George Payne was head of another department inside the U.S. Treasury. And of course, London in those days was less than 500,000 people. So the U.S. the Treasury, what we call the Exchequer, was probably only 20 people. So they would have known each other very well. So I see these teachings from stonemasons, the structure of stonemasons, the idea of building and using tools and using a Christian theme, you being connected to Taoism as a structure to put these teachings on. One of the important, why they would have done that is because of, at the time, the government was very wary of secret societies. In England, the Catholics had many times tried to overthrow the government. And so if you look at the constitutions of Freemasons of 1723, it says in there, after, I think the word is, I forget the exact wording, but it's something like after the resurrection of 1716. Well, that's only a year before the Grand Lodge, Premier Grand Lodge was set up. So a year before, there had been a resurrection. The Jacobites had come down from Scotland trying to take the throne of England, which was a Protestant country, but we had previously had Catholic kings. They were stopped at Preston, which is like 150 miles away from London. And so this was obviously caused a lot of consternation when Scotland tries to attack England. It was, a big issue. So it was noted in the constitutions. But that wasn't the last time. There were 3 other attempts. The last one was in 1749. So the Catholics kept on trying to take the throne of England. And so the government was very wary about people setting up secret organizations. Like now, the FBI, they look at anybody who may have some sort of belief structure that is different from the accepted one of the US government, and they monitor those people. Well, that's what was happening in England at the same time. And laws were brought in to outlaw these secret organizations. But Freemasonry was seen to be a kind of guild. And because it was copying the original operative stonemasons, and the third degree ritual was seen to be very similar to one of the plays that the operative masons put on. And it seemed to be a Christian theme with King Solomon's temple and things like that. So therefore, the government let it alone. It was exempt from the law. Second reason, of course, is because by that time, when William Pitt brought in the idea of these secret societies, law against societies that require a secret oath and things like this, at that time, we already had royalty as the Grand Master. So these 2 things, having this Christian type of ceremony, being based on operative masonry, and having a royal Grand Master, allowed Freemasonry to be exempt from the law.
Earlier today, I watched your video explaining about the Taoists and the popularity amongst the aristocracy and how it could have been worked into it. And I had kind of an aha moment when I read that, and when I heard that. And it made a lot of sense because, of course, they are influencers, and everyone, even today, everyone wants to know everything about the royal family and the British aristocracy. So it totally makes sense to me. And I kind of keep quiet about it because I know it's not an accepted process, that a lot of people want to believe that Freemasonry started back either in the caveman times or with Egypt, or, it was brought here by Adam, no matter however you wanted to do it. But I've never really thought it was that ancient. And and when you said that to me, it kind of piqued my interest that this probably was something along the line that could have been a Taoist teaching that was converted, let's say, to something that would be a little more palatable for an Englishman, especially an Englishman in the gentry. But the one question I was thinking when I was watching this is, where was you made a Mason? Was it in Great Britain or was it in Japan?
Yeah, I was made a Mason in Kobe in an English lodge.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, because I thought to myself, it's like, so when you say that when this Taoist compares to the EA degree, was that emulation degree, or was it Duncan, or what was you referring to?
Referring to Webb. So throughout my books, I use Duncan's ritual because it's accessible to everybody free online. And then they can check my quotations to see if they agree.
Okay, I was just kind of curious because I knew the Grand Lodge Japan, I think they use kind of a Preston, like we do here in the States, the Preston Webb type of ritual, I believe, from what I understand.
Yes.
But so I just thought, well, I wonder which one. And they're all kind of same, but they're all kind of different. But I thought, I was just kind of curious as, which one was the closest to this. Yeah. But, earlier when you were saying that the Taoists have the belief that you can be like a Christian and a Taoist, and that it's not so much a religion as it is a way of life, and how it's just, I thought, that sounds awfully familiar to something that we tend to say. And I thought, that's just kind of, to me, just kind of seals the deal, that really does kind of make it just make total sense to me. And if it's not, it's very close, and it just really makes a lot of sense to me.
Yes. And there's another point that I forgot to. because there's so many aspects to this, but the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, I mentioned that they were proliferating new degrees, whereas the Grand Lodge of England only had 3 degrees, and they didn't think it was necessary. So obviously they thought that that was the teaching. There was no more. And it fits extremely well with Taoist teachings, the 3 degrees. But the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, they introduced the Scots Masters and the Irish Masters. Both these degrees have Chinese words in the degrees. If you go and check the original degrees, they use them as both instructions, the Chinese word to kneel, to stand up. Also, one of the passwords is a Chinese word. That's how far China had actually infiltrated Freemasonry in the Grand Lodge of the Ancients. And I think the reason, again, for that is because they knew what was happening in the Grand Lodge of the Moderns, and they wanted to attract a better quality of member. The problem with the Grand Lodge of the Ancients is that all the members tend to be working class people. Some of them were not very well educated. And so there was this class structure between the 2 lodges. And so when the 2 lodges joined in 1813 and became the United Grand Lodge of England, there was some friction there. And it wasn't a simple thing at all, because the moderns were looking down on the ancients, definitely.
Another thing I'm wondering, and this is, I know, just pure speculation, was I wonder why they did convert it to more of a Christian theme versus, it seems to me that it would have been more mystical if they would have went with the Chinese theory, yes, instead of trying to make a King Solomon's temple. But yes, maybe they would have thought that was more blasphemy or something like that. Because if you think about it, in 100, go flash forward 100 years to the start of the Shriners, they actually, their story that they concocted was that they were traveling through, that they got their ritual from the mystics of the East and the Middle East. So it just, in a way, it's kind of funny how that, would have been more accepting 100 years later if they would have taken it from the mystics of Asia and China. But I guess maybe it was just that would have been just too considered, anti-Christian and heretic, yeah, or something like that.
Yes, I think you're right. I think the issue was that they had to be seen to be Christian. And that's why they had a Bible open on the altar. And they were just carrying on the tradition of the operative Masons, who were exactly the same. They had these, they were a Christian organization. They had initiation ceremonies. They had apprenticeships, and they also put on this mystical play every year. And so Freemasonry looked exactly the same as operative Masons that have been going for 500 years by that time. So yes, I think it was important to be seen as Christian. They didn't want to be seen as subversive to the government. Of course, we have to remember at the time, the Inquisition was also very active in Europe, not just in Europe, but in England as well. And the Inquisition wanted to know what Freemasons were doing. So you had the Inquisition and the Jacobites, who were very anti-Protestants. They would want to know what's happening. And that's why I believe the Tyler has a drawn sword outside the door, because there were real threats to Freemasonry in the early days. Now we don't think of a threat, but in those days, there were real threats to people's lives by meeting as Freemasons.
And off topic, that's one of the things that I find kind of sad is of all the people who were persecuted and had to do this and risk their lives and they still attended and they still practiced Freemasonry, where we can't get our guys off the duff and go out in their car and drive a mile or two to attend lodge, just because, they just, I just don't feel like getting on, the EastEnders is on this tonight. I would have their whole Salem watch that,
Right. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because many Freemasons tend to be a little bit disillusioned. Once you've been a Master Mason for 5 years, you're doing the same thing every month, and they say, well, where's the spiritual teaching? Where's the mysticism? And some people find it boring. And I think if you reevaluate and look at it from a different point of view, and for example, I'm looking at my book here, Initiation by Light. I give 16 correspondences between Taoism and Freemasonry. And also the lodge itself is just like a Taoist temple. But, we kind of accepted the Victorian teachings of Albert Pike and people like that. And we're not willing to dig any further, I think. And so I hope to make through my books, Freemasonry more interesting for young Masons who are a little bit disillusioned with the craft.
And I just happened to watch another one of your videos today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Has anybody answered the question on the quiz or the riddle that you put in the back of your one book?
Right.
Correctly?
Nobody's answered it yet. And I'm thinking of upping the ante and offering a $300 prize to anybody who can find the answer by December 2022. And I'm announcing it here for the first time.
Well, money always tends to motivate me to do things that I probably shouldn't do. And so it should probably do too. But
So the riddle is in my last book, Freemasonry Royal Arch, and it is to do with the hidden teaching in Freemasonry. But you have to think in Taoist terms to find out the answer.
Well, I'll have to read it and I'll have to see. I'm not the brightest bulb in the tree, but I'll give it a shot.
Thank you very much.
Well, Bill, I always thought you were the great light in Freemasonry, so I don't know if you are.
Well, I am. It's just that there's a lot of other fires that are a lot brighter than mine.
Oh, okay. Okay. One thing, of course, we could spend days, I'm sure, digging Chris on all the stuff you've researched over your career, but I think to your point, you've been in 5 years, not you, but any Master Mason, like you said, it's like, well, where's all the good stuff? This is just the same old, same old. How would somebody in any lodge in any, town across the world bring in some of those topics you have, because you have such a depth of understanding of how they connect together, how, for a lodge education on a night, how do you bring a little bit of that in to spark the interest of those to say, oh, yeah, now I want to learn a little bit more. Where do you start?
Exactly. So I've been asked this question before, and I'm now preparing a short book on lectures for the lodge. Each one's about 5 to 7 minutes long with questions and answers. So you can dive deeper into some of the subjects. For a very simple one is like the star in the middle of the lodge. What star is this? Is it Venus? Is it Pluto? Is it our sun? Is it the North Star? Is it the South Star? What star is this? Well, there is an answer to it. But you want to have some discussion about it and see if you can find an answer. Let's see, what else is there? There are just so many things to look at. I raise them on the back of my books. I got all these questions. I start by questioning with, Freemasonry, why people did this. Why did people spend, like one thing we have to remember is in these days, in the 1700s, people didn't receive salaries. Very, very few people were salaried. And one of the only people that got a regular salary were the clergy and soldiers. If you didn't pay the soldiers, you'd have a riot. So the king was paying them a salary. But people like teachers and doctors, they were paid piecemeal. So they were paid by the month or for doing certain jobs. Like a funeral, you get paid. And so these people were always looking for ways to make money. And why would they spend 8 years of their lives rewriting the rituals of a stonemason? The gentry. De Sagouliers is a doctor and a clergyman. George Payne is the director of Exchequer. He's a gentry is a type of junior nobility in England, below the aristocracy. Why would he involve himself in the day-to-day dealings of a stonemason's fraternity? Why would he care if they had quarterly meetings or not? Well, the answer is because they wanted to use that structure, etc., etc. So these are sort of questions, I'm preparing a book on it, and I want to help the lodge bring in some new type of education that's not based on morality and boring things like this, and geometry as well. Yeah, I understand that the ritual is hidden in a kind of cipher, what I call steganography. And so inside the cipher, you find all these answers. But we're just reading the surface story, and we don't get the whole story of Freemasonry. And that's just, as I started, Eureka is one of these keys which leads you down a rabbit hole to look more about the whole story of Freemasonry. And then you discover the alchemy. First thing is the second degree. You discover the alchemy in the second degree. And then you find the alchemy is also in the third degree. And then the spiritual awakening in the first degree. Anyway.
Yeah, just very fascinating. I'm going to pass it to Darren here in a second. He's for our Grand Lodge, our area education officer. And Darren has done things like this too, to bring some of those really sophisticated, complicated topics to a group of people, including myself, that really didn't have a lot of exposure to them, and try to break them down in such a way that, frankly, you can leave that meeting with something to either explore farther or say, boy, I can't wait till next month when we get a little bit more on it. So, let me give it to Darren now, but I think your book would be on target for that kind of an audience. For me, some guy I haven't read near as much as you or Darren. I've spent, my interests are, a little bit there and a little bit other places. But
Brother Chris, I was curious about Freemasonry and China, particularly right now. I know that Hong Kong was ceded by the British back to China. Was it around 2000? Was it
yes.
Yeah. So I would have thought that at that point there probably would have still been active Freemasonic lodges, at least in Hong Kong. But I would think with the nature of the regime in China that Freemasonry, if it does exist, is underground. Do you know if it's still being practiced and just being very practiced in a very clandestine, not clandestine in the way we think of clandestine, but secretive way? Or is the Chinese government basically stopped it all out in China? Do you know about any of this?
So I believe that the lodges in Hong Kong, there's Scottish and English lodges there, and also in Macau. I think they are operating, but I'd say cautiously. So they're not doing big events, but they're still meeting. But apart from that, I'm not very sure. So the Grand Lodge of China is actually based in Taipei, Taiwan. And also the lodge I belong to, which is the American lodge I belong to in Japan, is called Sinim Lodge, which is under the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. Grand Lodge of Massachusetts doesn't have numbers for their lodges, so just Sinim Lodge. That was originally in Shanghai. And during the Second World War, it had to move fairly quickly and came to Tokyo. So perhaps something similar will happen to the lodges in Hong Kong and Macau. Time will tell.
Chris, I was thinking, you're the past Grand Historian for the Grand Lodge of Japan. I've seen photos of the lodge room in the Grand Lodge of Japan, and it's gorgeous. I know everyone's probably seen them. And it'd be one of those bucket list items. I'd love to go attend lodge there, obviously. But can you kind of give us a kind of a thumbnail version of the history of the Grand Lodge of Japan? I think you may know a little bit about it, considering you're the past Grand Historian of the group.
The Grand Historian's role is basically, in our Grand Lodge, is to record the activities of the Grand Master during the year. And we don't really delve about in old history. So the Grand Lodge of Japan was set up when some Philippine lodges based in Japan after the war decided to set up their own Grand Lodge. And the Grand Lodge of the Philippines itself is based on the Grand Lodge of California. So we tend to copy the Grand Lodge of California ritual via the Philippines. These lodges then petitioned the Grand Lodge of the Philippines. I mean, they're so far away. We're thousands of miles away from the Philippines. Then we were in, I think it was 1958, we became a Grand Lodge. After the Second World War, General MacArthur helped us to obtain some land in the center of Tokyo. It had previously been the what's known as the Seikosha. Seikosha is the Japanese Imperial Naval Officers Club. And they had a restaurant there, meeting rooms. And one of the meeting rooms was used to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor during the Second World War. When we acquired the property after the Second World War, we demolished the building, but we saved the structure of that meeting room, the Pearl Harbor room, and in our Grand Lodge now, we still have the Pearl Harbor room exactly as it was in 1941, is it? When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor?
Yeah.
And the other thing is that the land that we got, so in those days, we had a lodge, but at that time, there was no Grand Lodge of Japan until 50s. So the Grand Lodge of Philippines and the Grand Lodge of England and Scotland, Massachusetts, and Prince Hall all had lodges in Japan. So when the Grand Lodge of Japan was established, all these other lodges were accepted, and but they were not allowed to proliferate. So that's the situation we have now. We have some 16 Japanese Grand Lodges, lodges under the Grand Lodge of Japan, as well as one English lodge, 2 Scottish lodges. I think it's 4 Philippine lodges. A second thing about which is unique in Japan is that after the war, they had the military occupation of Japan. And so many of our lodges are actually on military bases. And it's difficult for us to visit. Sometimes, depending on how the political situation is in America, sometimes we're allowed to attend these lodges on base. But when security is very high, then we're not allowed on base.
I was kind of given kind of a little bit of information about it just the other week. I was sent a message from one of the brethren in Japan, which surprised me because I knew you were coming on here tonight. And he bought my book and he wanted to tell me how much he liked it. And I said, well, make sure to stay tuned to Meet Acton Park here in a couple of weeks because we're going to have your past historian. And he knew who I was talking about. So I guess you must be pretty well known there. But yeah, I was just tickled he bought my book. So he's like one of 3. And then, and that it went all the way to Japan. And then, so it's like, well, shoot, this is just a real great day. He knew who you were. He bought my book. This is a great evening. I'm going to go have a second beer just to celebrate.
You don't do yourself service. I'm sure your book's selling very well.
Well, it's been a few.
Right. Well, the Japanese Masonic community is not very large here. We have, as I said, if you add them all up together, probably 25 lodges in Japan, and the total membership's less than 2,000 brethren. And probably 30% live overseas, particularly the military who do a 3 to 5 year term in Japan until they have a permanent change of station. Is that what they call it? PCS. And they're still Japanese Masons, but they're no longer in the country.
It'll still be interesting to visit there, though.
Yes, please come.
Yeah, we're going to put that on our list of Meet Acton Park adventure trips. We're thinking about starting a new subsidiary just for, if nothing else, all of our imaginary trips that we talk about every time we talk to a friend.
Greece, England, Hawaii, now Japan.
Yeah, I know it. I'm going to need to retire and just spend full time as a Meet Acton Park tour host. So.
Well, that speaks to the universality of of Freemasonry. That's what makes it wonderful.
No, and I think that's true. And I mean, really, it ties back with what you really gave as sort of the some of that, how it came to England to begin with. And it is that universality. And I think to me, that's one of the core themes, even if all these other things are weaved in with it. It's about humanity and how we interact with each other, or should interact with each other anyway.
Yes.
The opportunities we can have for these conversations and the sharing of ideas, but yet we know we come out of that same background. And it's, arguably, if we go with how you've explained and what you've researched, it's probably even older than we speculate in terms, maybe not as we know it today, but in terms of really of its origins, or even deeper and older than the stone guilds that we talk about all the time. And so, to me, it's that timeless part of being a good human being that transcended literally probably thousands of years, not just hundreds.
There was a quest in England and in Europe to see if Chinese philosophy could be amalgamated with Christianity, because Chinese Taoist philosophy was seen to be a meritocracy, and it seemed to be a great way for people to treat each other, and they felt that this was very similar to the teachings of Christ. And the Royal Society and people like Gottfried Leibniz in Germany, they were actually seeing if Christianity and Taoism could somehow be integrated, and perhaps the Lodge was successful at that.
Yeah, I think so. And we get near the end of our time here, but it is just those recurring themes. And, if I was kind of to summarize even what I would consider this an introductory discussion, it is that opportunity to explore new things, new ideas, understand how they have transcended time from the ancient to the modern, and challenge each of us as individual Freemasons to go out and do a little bit of that research and see how they pull together. So let me pass it over to Darren and Bill, see if they got any final questions or comments for you, and we'll wrap it up.
Brother Chris, just first of all, I'd like to thank you again for coming on the program. And I'm going to ask you to go ahead and talk about where people can get your books. And then also, I know that you've got a YouTube channel and also a podcast that you've established. If you want to give that information out as well, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Well, my books are under the title Spiritual Freemasonry as a series. I have one for each degree: Initiation by Light, then Spiritual Alchemy, Quest for Immortality, and the final one is Royal Arch. I also have on YouTube a channel called Spiritual Freemasonry, and recently I set up a podcast which is on Spotify, Anchor, lots of places. It's called Freemasonry in 7 minutes or less. Thank you.
I just want to thank you for coming on and really giving us something to think about. I mean, honestly, I would have never thought about, the Chinese aspect of this, and it really gives you something to think about. And I may have to look into Taoism a little bit more, because it really intrigued me from everything I've, listened to today and from what you've said. And I want to thank you for coming on, and I hope you come on and maybe get a little more in depth at a later time.
Thank you very much. I look forward to it.
And Chris, thank you for reaching out to me. It's that's been the most fun thing about when we started this podcast is, we're joking about our people we've met all over the world, but literally we have. And I think that's just not only speaks to the universality of Freemasonry, but frankly, living in this day and age when in technology we can dial each other up literally on the internet and have these conversations, and you're a half a day ahead of us on the time zones. And it's just really, it's amazing to what we can do today. So let me thank you for joining us. We'll put in our show notes the links to some of the things that you talked about, and appreciate all of our listeners. And so we encourage you to go out and look at Chris's books, his website, his YouTube channel, things, because I've been serving it here as well, and you'll learn a lot. And I think take those things back to your local lodge, and Chris will be out with a new book somewhere shortly down the road that'll give you a little bit of things that you can use, some of the more in-depth things we've talked about, to take back into the lodge. So again, thank everybody for joining us, and we hope all our listeners will join us again soon. for another exciting episode of Meet, Act, and Part.
Thank you for listening to Meet, Act, and Part. For more information about our show, visit our website at www.meetactandpart.com. While there, please consider supporting the show by sponsoring us on Patreon. Until we meet again, may we meet, act, and part.